discuss the idea of what causes independence. And I want you to think about these ideas in very broad terms, because we're going to look at this first through the ideas of what would become the American colonies transition into an independent collection of United States. And then eventually we'll look at how this impacts other states throughout Central, South America, and the Caribbean. So the way that I want you to think of this as far as broad terms, we'll start with the idea of where this comes from. And a lot of it all stems, like, for example, with the English colonies, with rebellion from within. And in England, there was already, and particularly also in France, and not so much in Spain, but in England, particularly, a battle between these ideas of how there was a threat to liberty posed by the power of the monarch. And this is where some of those ideas of the Enlightenment came from. So the rebellion ideas started in Europe and then started to come and pass through into the Americas via first economics, basically this idea of how the mercantilism system, which was strict control of the monarchy over the gold and silver that was being created in the treasury, and then in particular for the American colonies dealing with the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. The British won, but it was very costly, and so it created a lot of debt. So specifically, when you're looking at what would be the American colonies, this debt was creating an economic need for more taxes. And that then started to push its way into social repercussions, where groups like the Sons of Liberty started to form, creating boycotts and making meetings where they would make resolutions all throughout parts of the colonies saying that they were protesting things particularly like the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. And it's interesting with the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act because these were both industries that were very profitable for merchants. Paper, first of all, which is what all the contracts had to be written on, was being taxed. And so a lot of your bigger business people, lawyers, printers, they were having to pay a lot more just to make a certain amount of money, which they saw as being unjust. First, the second of all is the Sugar Act, which was a big part of one of the major imports and exports back from England and the colonies in the Americas, but also particularly with a lot of the French colonies in the Caribbean. And so you had a lot of places where some of these merchant marines, or what we call pirates, were basically secretly selling sugar and molasses to places, and then kind of refusing the tariff and the taxes, which really kind of banded a lot of the groups like the Sons of Liberty together. One particular group, the East India Tea Company, fell on a lot of the discerningness of the Sons of Liberty, and the colonists saw that the tea company was selling a lot of the tea at a cheaper rate, and they saw it as a trick, and this led to a lot of the ideas of what would start one of the biggest events really for the social movement to end the control of the political entity of the monarchy, which would be an idea for independence. Something that you can listen about in this video.
Over the horizon, what can it be? The pilgrims sailed the sea to find a place to call their own. In their ship Mayflower, they hoped to find a better home. They finally knocked on Plymouth Rock, and someone said, "We're there." It may not look like home, but at this point I don't care. Oh, they were missing Mother England. They swore their loyalty until the very end. Anything you say, King, it's okay, King. You know it's kind of scary on your own. Wanna build a new land the way we planned. Could you help us run it till it's grown? They planted corn, you know. They built their houses one by one. And bit by bit they worked until the colonies were done. They looked around, yeah, up and down, and someone said, "Hooray! If the king could only see us now, he would be proud of us today." They knew that now they'd run their own land. But George the Third still vowed he'd rule them to the end. Anything I say, do it my way now. Anything I say, do it my way. Don't you get to feeling independent, 'cause I'm gonna force you to obey. He taxed their property, he didn't give them any choice. And back in England, he didn't give them any voice. That's called taxation without representation, and it's not fair. But when the colonies complained, the king said, I don't care. He even has the nerve to tax our cup of tea. To put it kindly, King, we really don't agree. Gonna show you how we feel. We're gonna dump this tea and turn this harbor into the biggest cup of tea in history. They wanted no more mothering hand. They knew the time had come for them to take command. It's very clear you're beyond backing. No matter what you say, we won't obey. Gonna hold a revolution now, King, and we're gonna run it all away. With no more king.
We're going to elect a president.
No more king.
He's going to do what the people want.
No more king.
We're going to run things our way.
No more king. Tell us what to do. Rocking our own position and splashing over the horizon. What can it be? Looks like it's going to be a free country.
Oh, if it was just that perfect. So the Boston Tea Party essentially was a colonial reaction to the law that prevented tea from the East India Tea Company to be delivered at a lower rate. The Boston Tea Party started when Bostonians, part of the Sons of Liberty, dressed as natives and dumped the tea into the harbor. And this led to what would eventually be called the Intolerable Acts. Now, the funny thing about this is the big phrase they use is taxation without representation. But the truth is, even after the United States becomes a thing and is independent after the revolution and so on, the majority of the people who participated in it and then also were part of the United States eventually, they never gained representation, because you have to understand that if you did not own land and were a white man, you couldn't vote. And especially if you were Native, a woman, or an African American slave, you could not vote. So a real small percentage of people were only given that representation, which was kind of a misnomer on that. So the real instance of what happens is that this social economic idea plays out in politics, particularly with what's called the First Continental Congress, which was a response to the Intolerable Acts in a meeting in 1774 with men like Sam Adams, John Adams, and George Washington to discuss their problems with Britain. And this becomes the formal Declaration of Rights to appeal to the king and the British people for their independence. All right, so these are the basic ideas of the causes of independence, in particular to the American independence movement. But they're going to be very similar ideals when we look at other areas.